Hey, it's Miggy, and let's talk about the recently concluded Snapdragon Pro Series Challenge Finals. But before that, congratulations again to Onyx Philippines for that 4-0 clean sweep against Onyx Indonesia. And with that being said, if you want to get into the metagame, if you want to get into data analysis, you want to learn the game better, let's talk stats. So right here, this is the Liquipedia page of the Snapdragon Pro Series Challenge Finals. So if you want to get into the esports scene, if you want to understand, MLBB, this is the place to be. Liquipedia will give you everything you want to know because it's gonna show you who the participants are, the prize money, who won, the usual info you want to know. But if you want to dive deeper into the metagame, if you want to dive deeper into the esports scene, you want to be looking at the stats. So I don't want to. So here, I don't want to just like geek out, nerd out about the numbers here. So I'll give you guys a quick overview, and then I'll probably be explaining to you why certain picks were, or the standout things that I see from this overview. So before that, let's understand what these things mean. So here, if we're gonna look at the hero, you get to see who the most picked heroes are. So aside from seeing which heroes got picked the most and how many times they were picked, we get to see their win rate. So let's take Suyo for example. He was picked 77 times. He won 40 out of the 37 times he was picked, giving him that win rate of 51.95%. And then we get to see the blue side, red side. So this is when he was picked in red side or blue side. Yeah, duh. And then you get to see that he won a lot more of his matches, or he had a more positive win rate when he was played in the blue side. And then moving on to that, we get to the bans and the picks and bans. So basically, this is how often he was picked versus how often he was banned. And you get to see the played by, played with, and played versus. So we get to see which teams favored them the most, which heroes he was played with, or the team composition you want to be playing with Suyo, and the heroes he was playing against. So I know right now this sounds like for someone a newbie or someone who just wants to get into data analysis or wanna love and learn the game a bit more. These things just look like a bunch of numbers, right? But each number here, you could actually create a storyline behind it, or it gives you a deeper dive into why Suyo was picked a lot more. If we're noticing in the current meta, oh, by the way, before I get further into geeking out about the numbers and the story, this tournament is a unique beast, I'd say. Sure, setting aside the drama, right? We got to see Snapdragon Challenge Finals happen in between patches. So the group stage had a different patch versus matches in the playoffs. So you have to take that into consideration when you're looking at the stats. So before we get into the group stage and the playoffs, let's look at the overview. So going back to what I said about numbers having a story, we get to see that Suyo did get picked 77 times. But why is that? It's because he was prioritized because he is the current most meta jungler there is. He has everything, so he can sustain because of his access to defense or damage reduction. He has mobility if you tap his skills correctly. And then he's just an overall tank. He's tankier than most of the assassin junglers out there. So we can see that he was banned 11 times, meaning a lot of the teams prioritized him as a pick. So with him being prioritized as a pick, they have to be seeing something. Is it because Suyo forced their enemies to adjust to the Suyo pick? Is it because he's a lot harder to control? Are the meta heroes that need to deal with him not meta? There are so many things that you could think of when you just see these numbers. So yeah, he was played 32 times on blue side, 45 times on red side. So blue side tends to be first pick. But why isn't he first pick, right? So even if he was prioritized on blue side, he has a better win rate. Does that mean the enemies choose to leave him open because they have a counter to Suyo being second pick? So there are a lot of things you could look at and understand when you're looking at these numbers. And then here, when you're aside from those numbers, we get to see Onyx Indonesia actually prioritize Suyo a lot more actually. He was played in Onyx Indonesia 14 times, and then the closest one to him was Onyx. No, the closest team to pick it were SRG and Team Liquid Indonesia at both at 8. Does that mean that Onyx Indonesia prioritizes Suyo as a comfort pick? Does Kyrie work best when he picks Suyo because he could work or play with the team better as Suyo? And then we go with who he was played with. So Suyo was picked because he's a high damage dealing assassin jungler. Is that why Harith was viable? Because if you were both attack or damage dealers, you're not gonna your damage will be off or leaning towards a certain type, so either magic and physicals just to keep it balanced. He was played with Badang. Is it because his skills synergize well with the stun lock or crowd control lock that Badang offers? So there are a lot of these things, even in played versus. So when Suyo is picked, more often than not, Joy would be the counter jungler because once they see a Suyo, or once Suyo is picked, it forces the other team to play or pick an assassin hero. Because if they don't, they would be able to lock out or ban out all the meta viable assassin junglers. So this is why we see this. And then maybe Granger is picked because he offers a lot of mobility, meaning Suyo's not going to be able to shut him down. Mobility is Suyo's weakness, so if someone could just get away from him, he's not going to be able to burst them down. And Hilda and Hylos, just because they're tanky. And Luyi is able to, could potentially burst down Suyo as well. It depends on whoever casts their spell first. So just like that. That's just one example of analyzing the data we're given. And each of these numbers are part of a narrative that you can form when you understand the stats. So moving on, let's talk about the group stage and the playoff stage. So as I mentioned, a lot of this tournament is in between patches. So there are a bit of differences. There's a discrepancy between the group stage and the playoffs. So right off the bat, the most noticeable difference is that Uranus was picked in the playoffs, and Selena was also picked more during the playoffs. And this has to do with their buff. So Uranus got a movement speed buff, and Selena got a rework or an optimization on her skills, which makes her a bit more assassin-esque. So this means that just because they took down or sped up the animations in her skills, she could easily transition, and from being a long-range sniper mage, she can be mid-range and burst down or deal substantial damage to the softies in the front line or the back line. So that's just one example. Those are two examples of this being in between patches. So you have to understand that sure, there's a lot more data in the group stage, but it's because it's a wider or longer stage. There are certain picks and teams that tend to just cater to certain teams. So the data you might be getting is not the full story. So let's take one for example. So we saw take for example, I guess Arlot here. Arlot or Kadita. These are not your off. Yes, Arlot is meta at times, or it was a meta a few tournaments ago. And Kadita is probably a comfort pick. These are played by certain teams who have tried it once before. So the ones who played it, so Kadita was played by RRQ, and Arlot was played by Onyx Indonesia. So we have to consider that esports or tournaments are very different from our ranked games. There are a lot of things we have to consider, that these guys are pro players and they've been scrimming these things. So maybe they've scrimmed and had successes with Kadita, or they had successes with Arlot, so they decided to pull it off or show it off in the group stage. So yes, you do have a lot more data in the group stage, but you have to be able to filter through that data to see what is value for when you're analyzing the game. And then this is particularly noticeable in the group stage, in the playoff stage, because where's that? In the playoff stage, Granger was played 3 times. 3 times. Versus here in the group stage, he was played 41 times. So what happened? As I mentioned, there was a patch update, and there was a big damage nerf on Granger, which affected his scaling to mid game. So they decreased a bit almost half. They decreased a lot, almost half of this damage his skills would do. So his farming just became a bit slower, but people still saw him as viable. That's why we see him being played at least 3 times here in the playoff stage, right? But what did it mean? Is it because it's not to say that, Granger is should not be played at all, because as I mentioned, esports or the tournaments are different from our ranked games. It just goes to show that these teams had to adjust because yes, Granger was viable. He was scrimmed. They played him win scrims and he was winning them games. But they realized that the damage fall off or the damage nerf on him was just unplayable because he was banned 4 times and he was played 3, and three of the games he lost twice. So people had to adjust. So they had to pick out new marksmen. Yes, they couldn't scrim it as often as they did with Granger, but these are a little bit more viable. So this is why I said that you have to look at both datas. That you have to look at the group stage, filter through that, and then look at the playoffs. Because the playoffs in this particular tournament is different. There was a patch in between this tournament. So we get to see the rise of Moskov and Irithel. So these guys are the ones that replaced Ranger in the gold lane matchup. And just like that. So I guess if we're gonna look at this, I'm surprised that Gatot was actually picked 9 times, right? But here, take for example another particular nerf, a buff. CC had a really big buff happen. Personally, I think is a big buff that her spell vamp movement speed bar actually decays 1 bar at a time, so you just don't lose it completely. And she was played 5 times, and then she won 4 out of the 5. Versus if we look at the group stage, she was played. Let's look for her. CC. She was played 8 times, winning 4, losing 4. So like that. If you want to understand the data, the stat page is gonna be your best friend. But as I said, learn to filter through the data because every number tells a story, but you can't get the complete story if you decide to just corner yourself or focus on a particular page. So yeah, that's it for this video. This is me talking about stats, geeking out about numbers, and this is my unfiltered, unscripted analysis of what happened in the Snapdragon Pro Series finals. Congrats again, Onyx Philippines, and I'll catch you guys later.